I had to take this opportunity to call MUFON on the carpet because they refer to it as the alien reproductive vehicle, and I've had people asking me where the babies come from. So anyway, as far as my experience and how far back it goes, it's only been more recently. I've been chasing this thing since 1988, almost 30 years. It's hard to believe it's been that long. But I discovered that in 1952, when they had this vast UFO flap, as you call it, in Washington, D.C., as it turns out, in July of that year, my father was a dental prosthetics technician at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where James Forrestal was murdered. And 9 months later, I was born. So who knows? Maybe I'm a hybrid. I just don't know it. Anyway, after his work at Bethesda, my father was transferred to the Marine Corps station in, let's see, it's just north of San Diego. What's it called? No, it's the other one. Camp Pendleton. He was at Camp Pendleton, where my brother was born. And we lived in Vista, California, literally less than 10 miles from where George Adamski was having his whole UFO contact experience in the early to mid 1950s. So it's kind of been right in my neighborhood all the time, and I just didn't realize it. Anyhow, let's see here. Okay, there we go. Oh, okay, sorry. I couldn't see the right screen. All right. So let me give you a little bit of background on how this all started for me. I'm kind of a nuts and bolts person. When I was a little kid, my dad used to bring me in and ask me to take my little hands and reach down into the engine bay when he was working on the family car to get a nut or a bolt that dropped down to a nook or cranny that he couldn't quite get his hands into. And that was how I began working on cars and became a car guy and a nuts and bolts kind of guy. And so I really enjoyed the process of taking things apart and putting them back together. And I also happened to like dinosaurs as a kid. I was drawing dinosaurs all the time, and that's where my artistic background really began, was drawing dinosaurs. We lived in Arizona. My dad made an interbranch transfer into the Air Force. So we moved to Chandler, Arizona. He was stationed at Williams Air Force Base, where they were doing fighter pilot training. We did a lot of exploration in northern Arizona, where there were lots of fossil beds and this kind of thing. But anyhow, eventually, all of this artwork and dealing with machines and things, I decided that I wanted to become a car designer and work for Chevrolet or GM or one of the big three auto manufacturers. But at the time, minimum wage was about $2 an hour, and the premier college where everybody went to become a car designer was Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. And in 1977, tuition was about $1,200 per trimester. Couldn't afford it on minimum wage. So I realized I was going to have to probably go into the Air Force and get the GI Bill behind me in order to be able to afford where I wanted to go to college. And so went down, took the aptitude test with the recruiter, wound up joining the Air Force. And in fact, this emblem that you see on the screen here, I'm not sure where it is exactly. I see it on my screen. Oh, there we go. There, okay. That's the logo for my squadron, the 318th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Went through electronic school, learned about the weapons control systems on this plane. That's the plane that I worked on, or one of them, with the 318th. As it happens, while I was stationed at McCord Air Force Base up near Tacoma, Washington, there was actually an incident. It was an incident that occurred about the same time that let's see, the author who wrote Behold, Pale Horse, I think it was William Cooper, talked about being on a submarine out of Bremerton, Washington, on its way to Hawaii, that saw an immense saucer come out of the ocean and fly away. And it happened that our squadron, our planes were actually scrambled and sent out to sea in pursuit of something like that. Later on, there was something that came down out of the sky and crashed in the I guess it's the Cascade National Forest near Rainier National Forest. That's what it was. And we had a squadron mate who was a real off-roading enthusiast. He went out and tried to find where this crash occurred based on the data that he got from his friend at the control tower, and was confronted by some of the so-called blue berets that were there cordoning off the area. So these things were kind of going on in the background, and I didn't even realize at the time that there were other things that had happened to me as a kid that I didn't didn't have any memory of, couldn't explain it. So I wound up going to Art Center College of Design, and I wound up working not in the automotive industry, but rather in the aerospace industry, starting off with General Dynamics and doing illustrations of aircraft, gathered a bit of a notoriety as an aviation artist with military topics. I actually had the opportunity to trade some of my paintings for rides in aircraft like the F-16. This is a photograph I actually took from another F-16 where I was riding in the back seat like the two-seat version that you can see over there. And I would generally donate a painting to the squadrons when this would happen, give them a little bit of an incentive. So I wound up working for General Dynamics for a while, worked as a publications editor, as a technical illustrator, did a lot of illustration work, and then began freelancing throughout the defense industry and the aerospace industry. And it gave me an opportunity to see lots of different kinds of hardware, lots of different weapon systems. Everything that I did would start out in kind of the sketch form like this, where you would develop all of the details that you wanted before a painting would actually start. Those paintings and all the different types of aircraft that I did eventually brought me into contact with some of the manufacturers like Lockheed Skunk Works that were working on systems that the public didn't know about. Now, as it happens, I like to talk to people. I really enjoy hearing their stories, whether it's a contact experience or things that they've seen flying around, because as somebody who's in the industry and works on these things and I know that there are other systems that are classified that we don't see from time to time, and I can't explain why. There'll be somebody who will fly one of these things over a populated area under conditions that allow people on the ground to see the aircraft. And so I love to talk to people who've had these sightings, because you can kind of glean some details out of those sightings that you'll never get from the trade publications like Aviation Week. In fact, I actually did a lot of work helping to coordinate some of the details from these reports with Aviation Week, working with my friend Bill Scott, who was part of UFO Hunters with Bill Burns and that kind of thing. So anyway, mapping out the details for different systems, being able to understand how these things fit together, the things that make them work has always been a part of my work. And this process kind of came to a head around 1986 when I was approached by Lockheed Skunk Works to do an illustration for them of an aircraft that had not been built yet. And the pitch that they gave me was that they had a new request for proposal for an aircraft that was really, really fast. The whole program was classified. They couldn't tell me what the aircraft looked like. And so they asked me to come up with something that looked really, really fast. And so, having been a subscriber to publications like Aviation Week and Space Technology, having been on Air Force bases for many years because of my dad's 25-year career in the Air Force, and because I had always loved aircraft because of the organic shapes and the ability to fly and do all these different things in the performance of their duties, I knew about the SR-71 Blackbird, and I also knew about the XB-70 Valkyrie. Let's see here. The sketch that I came up with was pretty much what you see right here. This is what I gave to the people at Lockheed Skunk Works. And when I went back the next time to talk to the client, the individual that had hired me, and this was at the Calabasas division, which no longer exists, but he'd brought in two aeronautical engineers, is the best way I can describe them, with the white lab coats and the pocket protector and the slide rule and the whole 9 yards. And I opened up my sketch pad and I turned it around and I slid it across the table to show these guys. And almost immediately, I had the feeling that something was going very terribly wrong, because these two gentlemen started to get really upset. And I thought, well, I know I'm using some sound aerodynamic principles in the design that I've created here, but they were getting mad, red in the face. You could practically see the beads of sweat forming on their foreheads and this kind of thing. And the one gentleman slammed his hand down on the drawing and he says, well, what are these canards doing out on the wing, on the front of the plane? What are the vertical stabilizers doing moved out to the wingtips? These would be torn off at Mach 17. And then he caught himself and realized that he was disclosing classified information, telling me that this thing could go Mach 17. That's 12,000 miles per hour, Mach 17. And so I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't know why you're upset, but all I've done here is combine features of the two fastest aircraft that I know of, because that was the request, make it look fast. And so they started to calm down, and they gave me basically a design that they wanted me to draw after that, which was this funky thing. It looks like something from a Buck Rogers movie in the 1940s. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that this thing, I guess there's a laser pointer here somewhere. I'm not sure how, there we go. Okay, right in that area, I don't know if you can see the little red dot, but that's supposed to be a scramjet pod right there on the bottom of that thing. And there's another one supposed to be up on the top. I even did a little proposal for what the landing gear arrangement would look like in spite of these funky little Buck Rogers fins that were on there. So anyway, it wasn't too long after that, maybe 3 to 4 years later, that I got a call from Bill Scott at Aviation Week, and he said, there's been a near-miss incident with an aircraft that looked just like what you drew, or pretty close to it. And so I talked to him about it. He said there was an airliner flying out of Los Angeles International that went out over the ocean, banked around to the north, and was passing over the high desert near Edwards Air Force Base. And this thing was climbing up out of the base, and they almost hit. And so there was a report made. Anyway, at the time, that second aircraft that's riding on the backbone of this aircraft was not part of the deal. It wasn't actually seen at the time. But this aircraft was so large, I mean, close to 250 feet in length, very, very big aircraft. I began talking to people in the industry, friends of mine who'd been at different places at different times, who'd actually seen this aircraft, had actually seen it with another aircraft on its back. And in the industry, this arrangement is generally referred to as a carrier aircraft and a parasitic aircraft being the one that's riding on the backbone. But as time went on, even as recently as within the last 6 months, I continued to get eyewitness accounts of people who've seen this aircraft and this aircraft. So it appeared that there were two different solutions to the same RFP, or request for proposal, for what would be called a two-stage-to-orbit launch system. The idea being that you would have an aircraft that would carry a smaller vehicle that had the capability of not only flying and going out into space with rocket boosters, but would have the capability of coming back down through the atmosphere like a miniature version of the space shuttle. So this was in the time frame of 1986 or so. Well, it turned out that there were other aircraft types that were being seen about the same time. This was sort of the internal visualization of another aircraft that I'd heard described by witnesses. There was another aviation artist by the name of Hal McCormick who had a friend at an air show that had talked about a conversation that he'd had with a former astronaut who was ferrying a Learjet across Nevada, and he was flying through some heavy clouds, and he came out into the open air and realized that there was another aircraft in close proximity to him, same parallel course, same direction, but slightly below and to his left. And he came up on this thing, and he got a good look at the other aircraft, and then he realized that he might have collided with this thing in the clouds. And so he called the control center, which happened to be the tower at Nellis Air Force Base, because it was restricted airspace to begin with. And he said, Control, I got some traffic up here that I almost collided with. Why didn't you alert me to the fact that this other aircraft was up here? And they said, well, there isn't anything on radar. We don't have anything on radar. And he says, well, of course there's something on radar. And so he begins describing this aircraft with, the two tails, one above, one below, the NACA duct inlets, the splitter type canopy like an SR-71, and this ridge that kind of ran laterally across the widest part, but no wings at all. And so this was one of the aircraft that led to speculation about a new family of aircraft, high-speed aircraft, probably all a part of this program that I was asked to create some conceptual artwork for. And so this magazine here, Popular Science, had asked me to do some cover illustrations for something referred to as the Mach 5 spy plane. I think it was either Richard Dolan or Mike Schratt mentioned earlier about the seismographic reports of something leaving a supersonic footprint across the Los Angeles landscape at something in the area of Mach 5, Mach 6. And this was one of the concepts that they thought might be responsible for that. And as it happened, while all this other stuff was going on, this particular magazine wound up helping me to reconnect with a fellow that I'd gone to college with, who was mentioned earlier by Richard Dolan, is Brad Sorensen, who's an outstanding designer and someone who I went through college with in the transportation design major. He had seen the artwork and called me up, wanted to get in touch, and so we got together for lunch, talked about our careers, what we've been doing, and I knew that there was an air show coming up at Norton Air Force Base in about a week or so, and we made plans to go to this thing. And then at the last minute, the magazine got such a wonderful response from this artwork that they asked me to go ahead and do this issue here over the weekend, literally doing 3 illustrations in about 2 or 3 days. It was a really crash, but it was a lot of money and I couldn't turn it down, so I didn't go to the air show. So about a week or so later, Brad tells me that he had gone to the air show with one of his clients, who was a high-ranking executive at Lockheed Martin at the Skunk Works division. Now, I believe I know who the gentleman is. I'm not going to tell you what his name was, but he was somebody that eventually wound up working in the same general executive level as Ben Rich and Kelly Johnson. And his name sounded a little bit like Frank Carlucci, but that's not his name. Anyway, so this is the Lockheed Skunk Works here up in Palmdale at Air Force Plant 42. And the story was, and eventually the details came out, but the original story was that the exhibit had been in Norton Air Force Base in the big giant Quonset hut hangar that was at the west end of the airfield. But during the revelations about the alien reproduction vehicle and the Fluxliner, I had started contacting some of the people who were involved in UFO investigations, one of whom was a fellow by the name of Paul Shepard, who in the late 1980s, early 1990s was doing a lot of coverage on the Billy Meyer story, had a 900 number you could call up and listen to all the latest details. I found this in the back of UFO magazine, I think it was. So I contacted Paul and I said that I had this new information and I just felt that somebody ought to know about this, this new technology that was out there. And basically what had happened was that during the air show, Brad and this gentleman that he was with and about 30 other people got onto a Boeing 727, a military Air Force transport, passenger transport, and they flew from Norton Air Force Base, where the air show was, up to Air Force Plant 42 and to the Lockheed Skunk Works. They disembarked, went into the hangar, and almost immediately the fellow that he was with said, you know, there's some aircraft in here that you're not cleared to see, so we'll get out of here as soon as we can. Just don't say anything to anybody, just enjoy the show. So he went up to Lockheed Skunk Works right there, and they saw a lot of unusual types of aircraft. This was a proposed replacement for the A-10 Warthog, which is an anti-armor kind of a platform. This is what it looks like here. It's been around for a long time, was built by Republic Aircraft. Carries this giant Gatling gun in the front end of it that just tears the snot out of tanks. And, but this version that Brad saw was much shorter, much smaller, and it had this kind of a Venetian blind set of wings that had a pair of engines up front, and it would use the Coanda effect blowing over the wings when they were all folded up into one surface, so that it would provide a tremendous amount of lift. Now, one of the other aircraft that they had in this particular exhibit was the first generation Aurora aircraft, and this was one of my first rough drawings that appeared in Aviation Week in Space Technology, describing what it looked like and what its capabilities were. You might notice in the lower left-hand corner there, they actually had a series of 121 vertical launch tubes that were in the belly of this aircraft. And the deployment system for these, what amounted to MIRVs, multiple targetable, or multiple individually targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs. These reentry vehicles, the cone-shaped thing you see popping out of the hole there, basically sat behind a kind of like a space shuttle tile, a heat ablative tile, which was covering the outside of this thing. And the weapon would sit up inside this tube. Some explosive bolts would blow off the tile. There was a big giant coiled spring behind it. It would just push this thing out of the hole, and it would slam another tile down into place so that the aerodynamic cleanliness of the surface of the aircraft was restored in a fraction of a second. And then the reentry vehicle would then acquire its target and go in, and boom, you know, that kind of thing. So Anyway, this was a later drawing, a rough sketch, and you'll notice that the NACA ducts at the front end there were moved up and sort of hugged the front end leading edge of this thing. And it turned out that that wasn't really quite right either. There was an article that appeared in Jane's Defense Weekly in their intelligence briefing section that described a similar kind of aircraft, but they had the most rudimentary type of illustration to show what the vehicle looked like. This was a more refined version and more refined drawing that I did to sort of flesh out what the exhibit at Skunk Works had looked like, showing a little bit of the aircraft, landing gear and so forth. Had a unique set of tires on it as well. The tires looked like what might be called Aeroquip stainless steel mesh hose wrapped around a wheel. Basically looked like a weave of stainless steel wire, very tight weave, that protected the tires from the extreme heat conditions that this aircraft was subjected to. Now, one of the things that let me back up here. One of the things you'll notice is at the back end of this thing, there's kind of a little clamshell arrangement that opens up, and there's actually a rocket booster that comes out of there with a couple little maneuvering pods with maneuvering jets. And once this thing gets up to altitude, well, maybe I should back up even more. The propulsion system actually involves 4 big jet engines that are on the inside. And if you flip this thing over and you looked at the belly, you'd have the same number of inlets in roughly the same position on the belly of the thing. So there were a total of 8 inlets and 8 exhaust ports. And these ports were all designed so they could be closed up when the secondary propulsion system began operation. And that system really was nothing more than a ridge that ran laterally across the widest part of the aircraft. And it had all of these little fuel dispensers on there. And when it got up to something over Mach 3, this aircraft would begin dispensing fuel from those ejectors, and it would spontaneously combust in the superheated airstream flowing over the aircraft, and it would explode and expand between the supersonic shock wave that would separate at that ridge and the tapered afterbody. So it basically would squeeze the aircraft and push it forward, which is kind of what a linear aerospike does when it's in operation. Now, it turns out that, let's see, I don't see the image up on the screen. There we go. Okay. This is actually a little bit closer to what the design looked like. That top version shows the true and accurate placement of the inlet NACA ducts. And there was also apparently a manned version of it that had a little bit of a cockpit on the front end. It also had a number of thermal imaging cameras that were on the front. They were offset about 3 feet to either side of the center line that allowed the pilot to see the ground below in full thermal infrared imaging. So this thing could operate in any kind of conditions just about. So anyway, this was part of the exhibit as well. They had a section where they had these 3 flying saucers. They had a podium where a general got up and spoke. It was all behind a cordon. They had a rolling staircase that came up. And these things were floating off the floor with a number of these little like blisters on the top of the thing, kind of like a submarine door that was on the side of the vehicle and just floating off the ground, no landing gear or anything underneath. These are the larger aircraft. You can notice, you can see the difference in the scale. There was a 60-foot version, which is the one in the upper right-hand corner, which had a little bit larger door. The same size door as the smallest version, which was about 24 feet in diameter. And the largest was somewhere between 124 and about 130 feet in diameter. So anyway, that led me to doing this illustration here, which you've probably seen before. It's an illustration that seems to have just gone viral on the internet. It's plagiarized all over the place. And as it turns out, in the 30 years since I got this information, I've actually collected a lot more information about how it works, which I'm in the process of incorporating into a totally new blueprint that'll be for sale, and you can order it and you can find out some of the more important details that I found since this thing was first created. This is a little bit closer view of the thing to show some of the details. You can see that it employs an array of capacitors, 8 plates tall at the bottom. I've calculated it with the dielectric that's around this array that's in the bottom here. Where's the laser? There we go. Okay. Got the laser right in here. Oh, I'm sorry, the capacitor's right in here. And these things, each of the stacks is staggered so that the gaps between these plates lines up with the actual plates in the sections that are on either side. They all radiate out from the center. There's a total of 40. There's a sort of a significant side note to that particular number was that about the same time that I began investigating this particular story, there was a story that came up in the Los Angeles Times newspaper that was covering the phenomenon of crop circles. And there was a particular research following the crop circle phenomenon that was happening more and more frequently in the summertime over in the United Kingdom that said that they would find these crop circles and they were having problems with people hoaxing them and this kind of thing. But they wanted to find out some kind of criteria that would help them to establish the difference between the fake ones and the real ones. And what they found was that if you went back and looked at the same crop a year later as the new crop was beginning to grow in, or come in or grow in, that there was a remaining signature, there was a footprint that was left behind from the previous year on the real ones. The ones that had been made with boards and ropes, it just grew back like a normal crop. But the ones that had been subjected to the real emissions, whatever it was that caused the crop circle to form in the first place, always grew back as a circle with 48 spokes, like the spokes of a wheel. It just happens to be the exact same number that you would see in the capacitor section or the capacitor array of the ARV. So it seemed like there was a connection between propulsion systems and the phenomenon that was occurring in the crops over in the UK. So as time went on, I began looking at some of the details of this that were described for me by the eyewitness. Let's see here. I did have, at one point, I had an actual sketch that was done by the original witness, and I don't exactly know why it disappeared from this particular version of the slideshow, but anyway, it shed a little bit of light on what it took to put this illustration together, and that was that I had a really, really rough drawing, which more or less had call-outs, handwritten call-outs saying, okay, this section here is 12 inches thick, 24 feet in diameter, has this many plates, this section over here has this many layers of coils and wire and so forth. And so the system itself actually involved a big ring of coils that ran around the perimeter of the crew compartment and sliced through it right there. And this thing was about 9 inches thick at this point. It looks a little bit thicker because it's shaved off at about a 35-degree angle. The same thing down here, this is shaved off at about a 35-degree angle. But all these plates and all the coils that are embedded up in here are all completely encased in what was said to be a type of quartz called Herkimer quartz diamond. Now, when you actually look at that as a manufacturing process, you realize immediately that there have to be some extraordinary manufacturing techniques that are brought into play to make this thing work, because number one, the melting temperature of copper is something like 1700 degrees, but the melting temperature of Herkimer quartz diamond is like 3200 degrees. It's significantly higher, so if you're going to embed something with copper inside of something that's made of quartz with a much higher melting temperature, you realize that there has to be some special way of combining these things, either through a special alloy that can take a lot more heat, or the client just misdiagnosed what the actual material was. It looked like copper, but it may have been some other metal that had kind of a golden color to it. So anyway, since that time, there is a very tenacious historian, a friend of mine who you probably know, who has found some interviews that were done with this original witness with Bill Scott at Aviation Week. And those interviews wound up in an archive after Bill retired at McGraw-Hill. And they go into a lot more detail than what I'd actually been told. And what we found out since then is that those coils that are around the crew compartment are not wire, as you might think, because originally we thought it was part of a Tesla coil, where you have primary windings and secondary windings, and it generates a tremendously high voltage. But high voltages are something that this system generates. It just may not be generated in the way we originally thought. But what we found is those coils were actually square copper tubing, like waveguides, like something you would use to transmit microwave energy. And so the fact that it's fully encased in a dielectric material like quartz, and the fact that it has this square wave, we've computed that the actual length of this thing, given that the inside diameter of that coil is about 12 feet, we've calculated out to within just a few feet that the total length of that coil is approaching something around 3 miles. Now, one of the other things that was found in this interview was the claim that this energy form that was being used, being tapped into by this coil, which was called the antenna section, was an energy form that was moving through space-time at 500 times the speed of light. Now, Hal Puthoff is a friend of mine, and the first thing I did when I read this was get a hold of Hal Puthoff and say, I've never seen anything in the literature other than experiments with foliated capacitors and the Casimir effect and shooting lasers between capacitor plates to get it to go faster than the normal speed of light, but maybe, you know, anywhere from 8 to 40 times faster, something like that, but never 500 times the speed of light. And he was very careful about what he said to me, but he basically said, you're right, there really isn't anything in the literature about something moving or propagating through space-time at 500 times the speed of light. And so I thought about it for a while, and I sent him an email. I said, well, what about quantum entanglement? That's supposed to be almost instantaneous over tremendous distances. And again, he was very careful about what he said to me. He said, well, you know, we've found that there are quantum entanglement characteristics of zero-point energy as well. So that made me think that whatever this thing is picking up, if it really is an antenna section, and I have some friends that have looked at the circuit very close, and they believe that the antenna section is actually what is called a folded dipole antenna, which basically means it's like a loop that comes out, goes out like this, and comes back together and is tied together at the end, but that it's folded into this special configuration. And so that design, those features have significance in terms of what it takes to tap into the so-called quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum. Now, I have the highest respect for James Woodward. We've had our disagreements about what's really going on with the circuit, whether the circuit really exists. And I always learn something new when I talk to James. And I love the man. I think he's a genius. But I can tell you that the original witness is not the only person who's told me this. Now, the exact phrase that he used was that the system and its operation is entirely scalar. Now, scalar energy is another term that for a long time I thought was kind of just a generic way of saying zero-point energy or some aspect of zero-point energy, but I believe scalars, if I understand it correctly, are positive and negative factors in space-time that when they cancel one another, you wind up with something that is essentially has zero mass. And if you have zero mass, then all the other things about being limited by the speed of light, they go out the window. And this information came to me from somebody who had actually worked on this vehicle. Now, even as recently as 6 months ago, I've been contacted by people who claim that they actually worked on this system and worked on the system with physicists, very well-known physicists, some of whom are now deceased, who recruited some of these individuals and brought them into the program. They didn't go through any of the typical background security checks that you would expect to see. And in fact, I think this may be the avenue by which Brad Sorensen eventually gained access to these kinds of programs, even though he wasn't officially cleared to be able to see any of these things. And what I've referred to this program is the protege program. Now, the way it was explained to me, this famous physicist was giving a lecture at some college. He didn't enjoy parking in the faculty parking lot because the faculty were kind of sycophants, brown nosers and whatever, you know, kissing the shoes and all that because of who the man was. So he parked in student parking, and he just happened to park next to the car of this particular individual who contacted me. And so when the two of them went out to their cars and the student recognized that this professor, the scientist, was parked right next to him, he said hello, and then he got a little obnoxious. He says, well, now, do you really believe all the bullshit that you were just peddling in that lecture? And the physicist looked at him. He walked around the back of the car, and he looked him up and down. And so they started having this really intense discussion about the finer points of quantum physics. And after talking to this kid for about 10 minutes, he pulled out a business card and he says, you need to come work for me. And it turned out that this guy was up to his eyeballs in the Fluxliner and working for Lockheed. And this young man got to go into this program, no security check. And in fact, his security badge, as he described it, was one where it had the name of the scientist with a -2 after it, then the name of the protege with his photograph, and then the appropriate coding color band that they put on the security badges that indicates what his level of security clearance was. But he went everywhere, saw everything, and actually had hands-on experience with this thing. So little by little over the years, I've been able to talk to people who've had contact with these systems. So there's no doubt in my mind that they exist, whether or not I'm able to adequately explain the physics, because I could not do the equations for this type of science to save my life. All the Greek symbols and the rest of it, I'm lost, believe me. So anyway, for the next slide here, this is a, I don't see it on the screen here, but this is a computer-generated image that was put together by my friend, the late James Allen, who did a documentary about my work. And it turns out that he didn't live too long, didn't live long enough to complete the documentary that was originally his college thesis for a master's in film production. But he put together a film. It was called 0 Point, the story of Mark McCandlish and the Fluxliner. It's up on Vimeo. It's a free download, so you can kind of see some of the evolution of how the story came to be. He did this wonderful illustration, and this here is kind of taking the skin off the vehicle. And some of the other things that we've found since then is that, as we originally believed that there were 4 seats on this vehicle, we now believe that, given the actual diameter of that central column, which is referred to as the amplifier section, that there are really only 3 seats, not 4 seats. Principally because there just wouldn't be enough room for the backs of the seat to come up against that column side to side if there were 4 seats. So we believe there are actually 3 seats. Underneath those seats, right in this area here, you can see there's like what looks like a circular plate, which sort of doubles as a floor, but it's actually part of what would be called a homopolar generator. And because of the field, the electromagnetic field that's generated by this coil, the field looks like a big donut shape that, with field lines that stroke out through the middle, stroke perpendicularly through this disc, which rotates at a certain speed. And when you put those things together in the proper way, you wind up generating a tremendous amount of current, which is exactly what you want for a system that uses extremely high voltages like this. Now, one of the other things that came up in this recently discovered interview that was found in the Aviation Week archives was the fact that this thing will basically sit there and do very little until the power level on the vehicle begins to exceed 1,250,000 volts. Now, when you're talking about that kind of electricity, that kind of high voltage, one of the side effects, if you will, of using that kind of a voltage, that level of power, is that you see a tremendous amount of ionization occurring around the vehicle. This is why people often report, when they have sightings at close range, sort of an ozone smell in the air. This ionization has kind of an odor to it. And so this is one of the reasons why getting up close to these things, if you see them, if you have an encounter, it's not a safe and smart thing to do. Not because they aren't friendly aliens, not because, you know, whoever's flying it, whether it's our guys or somebody from out there, it's not a real smart idea to go up and put your hands on one of these things, because you might get knocked on your butt from the voltages being discharged and shorting through your body into the ground. So anyway, this next image here, I don't see it on, there we go. Around 1990, after establishing a correspondence with UFO researcher Paul Shepard, he introduced me to a gentleman by the name of Gordon Novell, who did an interview with Carrie Cassidy on the Camelot.org website. You can see it up there. This is a guy who, very bright, very smart individual, and he wanted to find a way to bring all this technology out of the black and commercialize it and make tons of money on it. That was his plan. And of course, being a young guy and being excited about the prospect of it all being disclosed finally, taking the veil of secrecy off, and flying to the moon every afternoon if you felt like it. These were exciting ideas. And so when I looked at the design of that central column, the so-called amplifier section, I saw what I thought was the makings of something that might be called a free energy device. Now, there's a lot of people that scoff when you use those kinds of terms, especially in the physics community. But this drawing here was done for an associate of Gordon Novell, this fellow that was introduced to me by Paul Shepard, who was investigating all these things. Now, he said that he'd gone up to Edwards Air Force Base, and he was shown this device here, and it was producing 125% over unity. That is to say that if you put in 100% power, that you get 100% plus 25 extra that didn't actually come from the input voltage. It was actually producing more output than what you put into it. Now, as an interesting coincidence, there's this pattern here. Notice the device on the bottom. There's a little bit more refined drawing, but it's exactly the same thing. And this is a device that was developed with the cooperation of Hal Puthoff and Kenneth Shoulders, who unfortunately is now deceased, and it was, the licensee was the Jupiter Toy Company. Now, yeah, this is the other, this is not the actual presentation that I had prepared. This is the other file, unfortunately. But I had a close-up of that patent that could show you when it was applied for and who the assignees were and so forth. But it was actually assigned to the Jupiter Toy Company, and the inventor was Kenneth Shoulders, who had a very serious interest in what he called exotic voltaic objects, or EVOs. But this particular device here was part of a much larger system that actually produced some anomalous kind of phenomena that suggested that there were other things going on in the quantum vacuum that you could actually tap into and make use of. Now, I found it kind of interesting that this illustration here appeared in one of the magazines that I had done an illustration for. And this is what is called an anti-proton trap. And you'll notice that although the shape of the coil on the outside around that column is a little bit taller, a little bit different, the general layout in terms of the magnetic field lines and what's going on in the middle suggests that there may be something else happening there that is a similar kind of mechanism that would be employed inside the alien reproduction vehicle in its amplifier section. So I began looking at all of the different configurations that might fit the bill, so to speak. I looked at the stories of the legendary Nazi bell, the Die Glocke, I think it's called, that was tested in the Wenceslaus mine that Thomas Keller talked about. There's still some debate about whether or not those stories are true, although there is a physical location with physical signs that something involving high voltage experiments were done there. And it was described as a device that had two concentric cylinders, one inside the other, with some large coils around the outside, very similar to the configuration of the alien reproduction vehicle, and that there was a solution on the inside that involved a Nobel gas in some instances, or the use of mercury, thorium, which is a slightly radioactive isotope, and something called beryllium oxide. Now, I talked to Hal Puthoff about what the reason for putting the thorium in there was. And he suggested that if you're putting a lot of energy through a system like this, and you have some other energy form that you want to come out of or to be emitted by this device, that one of the ways to sort of make it a little bit easier is to, as he put it, lower the threshold of emission. And you can do that by adding just a little bit of radioactive material. And so that may be one of the explanations for the use of thorium. Now, the beryllium oxide I wasn't too sure about, but I talked to an engineer who knew a lot about electricity, and he said, well, you know, beryllium oxide may actually be used as a kind of wetting agent, if you will, that keeps the mercury in contact with the electrodes so that when these extremely powerful bursts of electricity come through the system, you don't get this cavitation occurring, which will cause the electrodes to erode and wear out very quickly because of the just monstrous amount of electricity that's passing through the system. So this is a little, well, this is upside down, but this is sort of a look at the planetary gear drive that actually separates and moves the two different cylinders in opposite directions. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why would you want to do that? Now, I'm going to go off the tracks a little bit here because when I was investigating all this stuff in the early 1990s, I heard all these stories about people being abducted by aliens, and I thought it was all a little woo-woo, kind of hocus pocus, that there wasn't anything to it. And so I thought that it might be possible that if anybody who claimed to have these experiences was actually being taken aboard a craft that came from another star system, that there might be a chance, however slight, that some of these people actually got a tour of the spacecraft, that got to see the engine room, as it were. And so I began looking around for people who claimed to have this experience. There were 3 young ladies that were interviewed on a radio station out of Las Vegas. It was sort of the predecessor to Coast with Art Bell, and it was called The Billy Goodman Happening. This was around 1989. And Billy Goodman had the show that covered the same general genre of subject matter, you know, ghosts and UFOs and aliens and this kind of thing. And so these 3 young ladies, one of whom is actually in the audience right now, were interviewed by Billy Goodman, and they talked about their abduction experiences. And so I was able to contact each of these people through Billy Goodman, and I asked them, I said, well, you know, would you sit down and talk with me, and I can work like a police sketch artist and do composite sketches of what you saw, whether it's, you know, the aliens or the, you know, the components that you saw inside the vehicle, what the vehicle looked like, and all this kind of thing. And to my great surprise, there was 1 or 2 of these individuals that actually described components that looked almost identical to the components in the alien reproduction vehicle. Now, one of the ways that you kind of keep things sterile from an investigation standpoint is that you don't allow a lot of your information out, so you get this cross-pollination or pollination that occurs between one source of information and another, where you have people saying, oh yeah, I saw one of those too, when they've already seen the other stuff you had to say about it. But in this case, we had 2 people that described components like what was in the alien reproduction vehicle. But this is before I'd ever gone public with what I knew about it, what it looked like. So that was really startling by itself. But in one instance, this one young lady described going through a rather torturous process where she sort of reached a status where she was accepted by the crew of this craft and allowed to move freely through the craft after going through some horrendous testing, if you will, in terms of whether she was actually a peaceful individual. I mean, they literally put her in a situation where they asked her to kill another individual, another human being on the ship, and she refused to do it. And when she refused to do it, they said, well, if you don't kill this man, we will kill you. She still refused. And then they said, well, if you don't kill him, then we're going to kill him and we'll make you watch. And that's what they did. And so, of course, she was traumatized by this. But then, almost immediately, the whole thing was wiped away, and the man is still laying there on the gurney without a scratch on him. And it was all just a mental implant, so to speak. And so she passed the test. She knew, or they knew, that she was not someone who would react violently to seeing something like that. And so from that point on, she had carte blanche to go through the craft. And they took her into the engine room. And in James Allen's film, you'll actually see a rendering of what she saw in the engine room. And it was very close to what was described by the original witness on the ARV story in terms of a central column, a disc that was on the column, a large band of coils embedded in a glass-like substance around that thing. And then, of course, the bottom of the vehicle was all these radially oriented capacitors stacked up very thick. And so this was something that I hadn't expected. And so I began cultivating a friendship with people who had had these experiences. And this is sort of the top end of it, showing what you might expect in a kind of liquid mercury-based amplifier section. Now, Brad, in his original discussion or description of the alien reproduction vehicle, said they were using a noble gas of mercury. They were using a vapor of mercury. They were not using a liquid mercury. But one of the witnesses who saw the internal components of one of these craft that she was taken aboard said that they were using liquid mercury. And so one of the things that she said about that was that the central column was made of a glass-like substance that you could see through it. And on the inside of this glass column, you could see what looked like a silvery liquid substance. And it had little flecks of what looked like carbon and silver that were shimmering around as the liquid was moving. And she said that there was a turbulence pattern that was very distinctive. Now, there used to be a carpet cleaner, I think it was called Super Blue or Mega Blue or something, but it had this sort of metallic liquid quality, and when you'd shake the bottle, you'd see all these beautiful turbulence patterns and so forth, and it looked kind of like that, except that inside this glass column, she said that it looked like a series of small tornadoes that were spiraling up around the inside, like a helix, except that the only way you can get those kind of turbulence patterns from a fluidics or hydrodynamic approach is to have 2 columns, one on the inside, one on the outside, turning in opposite directions. And what you get is a shearing force, like rolling a pencil between your fingers when you do this. And so you have an influence on the inside where the cylinder is turning one way, the one on the outside, and so you get the fluid basically rolling in these little turbulence patterns that spiral upwards. So you know that there's something special about the way this thing is constructed. So therefore, from a mechanical standpoint, you're going to want something like what I showed you there, the planetary gear drive system that actually permits the two columns to rotate in opposite directions. Now, one of the byproducts of that, if we can have that image back up on the screen, please, is that when the Mercury comes up in this gap between the two columns, it gets up here to a point right in here. And what I've done in the next illustration is I've shown basically what I would call a pulsing mechanism for the liquid mercury. And the idea is that as the mercury comes up through the outside gap on these two columns and it pours back down through the hole in the middle right there, right in that area there, it goes into this channel that goes down between this cone-shaped electrode here and a sort of an annular electrode there, almost a venturi. Now I got some of this wrong based on data that's come to me since then, that the internal shape of this chamber down here is more like the shape of the ancient amphoras that the Greeks used to transport wine in and so forth on their ships, where it comes down in a venturi like the opening for an amphora, and then there are some shoulders on the top of this jug. And so what happens is when the fluid comes down through this channel, and you have this sudden burst of electricity that goes between that cone in the middle and this ring where the discharge jumps across, you have this ionization process where the mercury that's pulsing through the venturi bursts through that opening, and because of that undercut around the opening, you have a turbulence pattern that moves down like this. You basically get the same process you would get if you were blowing a smoke ring. If you smoke a cigar and you've seen someone blow a smoke ring, you've got a shearing effect that occurs there where you have the gas is coming out of your lips very quickly and the smoke is emitted and the smoke moves out and creates this self-organized structure where the smoke holds the shape of a ring. And you could do the same thing in this thing here, and I believe that in some of the experiments that have been done in trying to replicate the phenomenon of ball lightning, that it's actually been modeled as a kind of toroid, like a donut shape. And so that is the kind of shape that I believe actually is transitioning down through let me go back one here. Yeah, we'd actually, this is upside down of course, but it would actually be moving through the column in the inside, so that you have this spiraling pattern that's established by the shearing effect between those two cylinders on the outside. And as the fluid pours down the middle, it's still twisting and turning, kind of like the water when it goes down the drain in your sink, and creates this twisting effect as it's going down into this position where it suddenly is subjected to this tremendous burst of energy. And then you have what looks like a donut-shaped, self-organized structure of ions that shoots down through the column. Now, one of the things that was revealed in later disclosures was, now I've actually shown, it's hard to see right here. Let me see if I can get this, there we go. Oh geez, gosh, sorry about that. Push the wrong button. Okay, go back one. All right, here we go. Right, okay, right there, you can see some wires, some coils wrapped around that inner chamber. And I was almost right. It's not quite right. What actually is on the inside of that chamber, you know, the shoulders that undercut right below the venturi and go down the sides, but the insides of that chamber actually have what would look like a very long bottle brush made out of a special metal that has a very high melting temperature. And it spirals up from the bottom on the inside of that inner column. And I believe that this what I would call a bottle brush electrode is actually responsible for picking up the energy that is being delivered, probably tapped right out of space-time, and it's basically dumping onto the whiskers of this electrode that runs down the inside of this inner column and is then taken out and rectified, basically allowed to build up a charge on the capacitor plates or on the outside on the bottom of the vehicle. Now, this is one way of developing a tremendously high voltage. And that's exactly what you need if you're going to exploit this kind of technology. Now, in the beginning, I thought that the system was based entirely, its levitation was based entirely on the so-called B-field Brown effect, and based on some of the discussions I've had with Thomas Townsend Brown's daughter, Linda Brown, who's been here in the audience in the past and maybe here right now. It seems like that may be one of the mechanisms that helps to get this vehicle off the ground, but it may not be the thing that helps to sort of reduce or eliminate its mass. And if you know anything about the work of Einstein, one of the things that he had said was that it was impossible to exceed the speed of light for one main reason, and that was as you accelerate through space-time, the atomic structure of your vehicle has an ever-increasing interaction with this quantum zero-point energy that's embedded in the fabric of space-time. And that energy is actually the very energy that keeps all the little components in every atom, the electrons, the neutrons, the protons, that's what keeps them going all the time. That's why matter itself is sort of the perfect model of a free energy device, because it never slows down. The particles never stop. They're always going because they're always being re-energized by the absorption of this energy. So as you move through space-time and you accelerate, the absorption of that energy increases. And that's what increases the effect of mass. And when you come down, you slow down again, all that energy dissipates back into space-time, and the mass goes back to what it was before. So Einstein said that you can never go faster than the speed of light, because as you begin to approach the speed of light, the interaction that you have with this zero-point energy in the environment is so tremendous, it becomes almost infinite. So you have so much mass that you can never possibly carry enough propulsive force with you to be able to go beyond that barrier, that threshold. Well, what if you turn it all around and you use that energy as a source of propulsive power? So what happens then? It's, theoretically anyway, not interacting with the structure of the vehicle, so your mass doesn't increase, but instead the energy being used as a propulsive force. So literally, the faster you go, the faster you're able to go, because there's more and more energy available. Now, I know that there are a lot of physicists that scoff about this, but there are a few that said that this may in fact be what actually gets this thing going. Now, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not there's a secret space program. And all this information suggested to me that yes, there was a secret space program. This particular object that you see right there, that's a close-up there. This is a kind of a boomerang-shaped object that had a lot of strange faceting to it, very much like a stealth fighter. This is an enlargement. This was taken from a Polaroid, not a photograph, not a digital photograph. This is something that was taken from a little tiny square Polaroid that I've actually held in my own hands. And when you magnify it, this is what you can see. Now, under a loop, a little magnifier, I've been able to look at some of the details. This is a sketch that was done by the witness who had the Polaroid camera. And let's see, I guess I must have, yeah, okay. So there is a drawing that I did based on what I could see through the loop. And it seems to have an odd shape. It's partly because the sort of wing shape that's on the far side of the front end is actually partially obscured by this little segment that is right there in the front. I don't know if you can see that. Oh, there we go again. All right. Okay. So over time, I had encounters with lots of other people who saw other programs, had other experiences, and one of those experiences was something that involved a pilot, or excuse me, a gentleman who had been a pilot in the Second World War. He started out his career flying B-24 Liberators in World War II, and wound up in the mid-1960s as a navigator in a B-52 flying over Vietnam. Their aircraft had been damaged by shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile out of North Vietnam. And so they were taken over to Guam, where they did a lot of repairs on these aircraft and then sent them back to their squadrons if they were reusable. And while they were flying back from Guam, and this is a really rough sketch, I've got to do a nice painting of this so that it looks a little bit better, but this will give you an ideal scale. The little dot that you see up there is representative of a B-52. The gentleman, when he described this thing to me, said that they were over the ocean with no clouds whatsoever, full moon over the ocean, with the light reflecting up off the surface of the sea. And this thing came up and began paralleling their course on the left side of the aircraft. That around the edge it had a series of what looked like giant turbine blades, each one of them the size of a big bypass door on a hangar. And at the top, when I asked him how big he thought it was, he said, well, we thought conservatively it was between 1/4 and 1/2 mile in diameter. And I said, well, how could you figure that out when it's dark and, you know, in the middle of the ocean, nothing for scale? And he says, well, we flew all around. You have to remember that the B-52 at that time had an electrical system that was all shielded against electromagnetic pulse if they ever had to drop an atomic bomb, which would, you know, fry the electronics unless it was shielded. So they felt that the reason they were able to fly next to this thing basically unscathed was because their electrical systems were shielded. But he said one of the ways that we sort of figured out how big it was is that that dome that was on the top was kind of like a translucent white Lexan. And he said it was illuminated from the inside, and you could see these little humanoid shapes, you know, walking around, working at workstations and carrying things. And he said we could see the individual floors inside the tower, and we counted 27 stories. So anyway, this vehicle followed along. They got kind of close. This is another really rough sketch that I really need to replace. But anyway, it gives you an idea of kind of what the relative position of the two vehicles were at the time and the conditions in terms of the lighting, the moon up above, the reflections of the moon off the ocean. And he said that after this thing had been following them for about 30 minutes, so they got a really good look at it, it suddenly moved off a little ways and then decided to just took off like a shot. But in the process, he said that this thing seemed to open up this shimmering tunnel of light. And he said that as it moved deeper into this tunnel, remember it's a fully black sky with no clouds, with the moon overhead. He said this thing came out into what looked like a blue daylit sky with white puffy clouds. And he said it was almost, the lighting on this huge disk was almost like it was coming out of a garage into the sunlight as it emerged from this, what appeared to be a navigable wormhole. So he said that once they made it back to Thailand in their base, taking this plane back to their duty station, that they went through an extensive debriefing with people who he said he thought belonged to the FBI, but he wasn't really sure about that aspect of it. Now, as far as talking to people, and you have encounters where you're in an internet cafe and you hear somebody over here on this computer and they're saying, oh, magnetic fluids, and do you think that was part of the system? And, well, it crashed over here and there are all these soldiers. And so my ears perk up and I said, what are you talking about? What's this? This fellow was in the Army, and right at the end of the Cold War in 1989, it was pretty clear that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. And there were a number of people who were behind the Iron Curtain who were double agents, people that were put there, implanted in the government and other aspects of the East German and other governments, that were people that really worked for us. And there was a big concern that if there was any question about the loyalty of these individuals to the outgoing government system, that they would be killed. And so this fellow was part of a unit that flew a nap of the earth, right down in the valleys kind of mission, took a helicopter like this one that was shown in the photo up there on the screen. It's a Nighthawk helicopter, a Black Hawk helicopter. And they flew into East Germany to retrieve some of these agents who were waiting for them at a pickup point. While they were on the way there, they were diverted to another place. It was referred to as a crash site. And this crash site involved a vehicle that had a strange triangular shape. Now, this is a rough sketch that was kind of put together by the eyewitness himself. And this is also something that needs a little bit refinement as well. This is something from the program that shouldn't be up here. The other one that's on the thumb drive somehow isn't up here where it is, where it's supposed to be. But anyhow, so this thing had kind of an elongated triangular shape like an arrowhead that was flying backwards, stubby in the front, long and pointy in the back. And under each of the corners was a large white sphere that had kind of a scalloped appearance. There is an illustration. This is something that was done by my friend Mike Schratt that shows a little bit clearer image of what the thing actually looked like. You have the front view, side view, top view, and so forth. But probably about 20 to 25 feet long, had a cockpit on it that looked remarkably similar to the one on the stealth fighter with the jagged edges that helps to defeat the reflection of radar and so forth. And But it had these little spheres that were underneath. When the thing had been flying a reconnaissance mission inside of East Germany, it had come up through a canyon and was climbing over a ridge and basically clipped the side of a pine tree, left front corner. And basically, if I go back here, you can see from the diagram, you see the left front corner there is all smashed. And this thing, when it hit, immediately the little globes or spheres that were underneath this thing were responsible for propelling it forward and for keeping it aloft. And when they lost the left front corner, it immediately began to do this kind of a pitching forward and rolling to the left. And so the pilot pulled up and he hit tail first and basically broke the tail off so that it bent upward like a scorpion tail, which you can kind of see from the diagram there. But when it split open in the middle, all of the structural details were visible, and it looked like a carbon composite structure, sort of a honeycomb structure, which had what looked like gold wire mesh embedded in the carbon around the inside. And this is probably something that helped to screen all the avionics from being detected by radar or what have you. He said that when they landed, the pilots had already been extracted from this craft, and that there were a couple of technicians wearing the white lab coats that were extracting, taking all the valuable avionics and things and that could control the system out of the vehicle. But when this thing impacted on the tail, the little globe that was about halfway back, almost three-quarters of the way back in the fuselage that was underneath, had actually been ejected forward and wasn't damaged, but it had actually torn free from the fuselage, and it had a couple of wires sticking out of the top, and it looked like a white ceramic pumpkin with kind of this, almost like the terracotta tiles you see on a missionary-style piece of architecture. It looked like a white ceramic, and the thing was bobbing around the landscape, and every once in a while it would stop, and it would begin to spin really fast, and it'd bob up and down, and there would be sparks jumping across these two wires that were up at the top. And then once that discharge occurred, it would settle down and it would just sort of hover around like this. And so the fellow that I talked to was tasked with trying to recover the sphere as they were extracting as much from this crash site as they could. One of the things that they tried to do was they tried to go and take one of these utility cabinets, big yellow boxes that are made out of aluminum with a piano hinge along one side and the little turnbuckles on the other side and a big handle. And they tried to walk up and just sort of close it around this thing. And anytime the aluminum got near to this thing, it would begin to basically move away because its magnetic field was reflecting off the aluminum, and it was basically repelling away from the case. And so what they did was they undid the piano hinge, they took the smaller part of the lid and they slid it underneath this thing, and then they brought the larger part of the case down over the top of it, engaged the hinge, closed the turnbuckles, and as soon as they let go of this thing, the whole thing stood up on the end like this and did this. And then they tied a big, long, 100-foot synthetic lanyard to it, and they brought in a CH-53 Super Stallion like this to carry it away. Now you'd wonder, how can you do all this when you're behind enemy lines in East Germany? This is like 10 kilometers southwest of the town of Halle, East Germany, H-A-L-L-E. And it was in a valley, there was a little river going nearby. They took a lot of the debris that they collected, and it was taken down the hill to a road where they had basically absconded with a couple of Mercedes-Benz flex vans. And this vehicle here took away the little ball hanging down below it so that whatever the emissions were from this thing, it wouldn't affect the avionics of the aircraft. And this is pretty much the end of the slideshow part of the discussion. But this is my friend James Allen, who made the film that I told you about earlier. And I think he was murdered. When he was making the film, he suddenly became very ill. He was diagnosed with an extremely aggressive form of what is called bile duct cancer. And it just so happens that that particular cancer is something that happens often to people who've inadvertently ingested radioactive thorium. And so he was dead 2 months later after diagnosis. Never finished the film. The film had to be completed by friends of his. But we did some pathology on blood and tissue specimens, and not only did we find thorium, we found uranium, platinum, lead, cadmium, and at least 1 or 2 other radioactive isotopes, and a lot of heavy metals. Basically looked like a cocktail for killing somebody. And so we've told the FBI about this in Savannah, Georgia, a couple of times. Most recent time was a year ago in July. They haven't done a thing. Didn't look into it, didn't do anything. So, yeah, there are people who are harmed by revealing this kind of stuff. I've often wondered why I wasn't harmed. I have been threatened. But I'm still here. And what I'd like to say is that one of the things that you can do to support the kind of work that I do is, if you get a chance, you can contact me on Facebook if you'd like to get a copy of that cutaway of the propulsion system. I'm going to be adding some new details to that from eyewitnesses that I've encountered over the last few months, and trying to bring it as close to being complete as I can. As you may be interested to know that I'm also working with a couple of electrical engineers, and we're actually trying to put together kind of a test bed to figure out exactly what it is that makes this thing go. We're actually going to try and build something. We have some people that have some really remarkable qualifications in terms of their personal experience and things that they've designed and worked on, not only in the military but in the civilian realm. And so we're going to try and do some experiments to show once and for all that this isn't just some story that I cooked up or some cute little tale that somebody I know in the industry shared with me. But you know, I spent 30 years talking about this stuff, and it'd be nice to know exactly what it is that makes it work. And so if you have an interest in participating in that, if you have a physics background or an electrical engineering background, or if you have funding that you'd like to provide, because the materials involved are kind of expensive, we would like your help. And so, like I say, you can contact me on Facebook, and once I figure out that you're not crazy, then I might give you my personal email. And I mean no disrespect, but you know, so. And believe me, I've had family members that have kind of suggested that maybe I am too, but you know, that's the way it goes. So.